So how Americans reacted to those no good, very bad years really has shaped the world in which we find ourselves. The big story of the 1970s is economics. 25 years of broad economic expansion and prosperity came to a grinding halt in the 1970s, meaning that our party was over. And what did we get instead? Inflation and extremely slow growth. What happened to the American economy in the 1970s was the result both of long-term processes and unexpected shocks. The long-term process was the gradual decline of manufacturing in the US in relation to competing manufacturing in the rest of the world. Part of this was due to American policy. After World War II, you'll remember that we promoted the economic growth of Japan, Germany, South Korea, and Taiwan, ignoring tariffs that they set up to protect nascent industries and effectively subsidizing them by providing for their defense. In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, America experienced an export trade deficit, importing more goods than it exported. One reason for this deficit was because the dollar was linked to gold, making it a strong currency, but also making American products more expensive abroad. So Nixon took the US off the gold standard, hoping to make American goods cheaper overseas and reduce imports. This was especially true in manufacturing. In 1960, 38% of Americans worked in manufacturing. In 1980, it was 28%. Today, it's 9%. So by 1970, competition led employers to either eliminate high-paying manufacturing jobs, or else to increase automation, or to shift workers to lower-wage regions of the US, or even overseas. Meanwhile, the northern industrial cities, particularly the Rust Belt of the Midwest, were becoming the empty urban playgrounds that we know and love today. The 1970s saw two oil shocks that sent the economy into a tailspin. In 1973, in response to Western support of Israel, Middle Eastern Arab states suspended oil exports to the US, which led to the price of oil quadrupling. And then in 1979, a second oil shock hit the United States after the Iranian Revolution. So during the 1970s, inflation soared to 10% a year, and economic growth slowed to 2.4%, resulting in what came to be known as stagflation. Americans got to experience the joy of 2 years of Jerry Ford before poor Jimmy Carter had a chance to fail at improving the economy. The only president never to have been elected even to the vice presidency, Gerald Ford was so insignificant in American history that we already replaced him on the chalkboard. Inflation did drop, but unemployment went up, especially during the recession of 1974 and 1975, where it topped 9%. Now, Ford would have liked to cut taxes and reduce government regulation, but the Democratic Congress wouldn't let him. So that's Ford, probably best known today as the first president to be satirized on Saturday Night Live. Then, in 1976, we got a new president, Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter is generally considered by historians to have been a failure as president, although he's often seen as a really good ex-president. He tried to fight the inflation part of stagflation, and to do it, he acted in some rather un-New Deal Democrat ways. He cut government spending, deregulated the trucking and airline industries, and he supported the Fed's decision to raise interest rates. So Carter says that Americans have lost their ability to face the future and some of their can-do spirit. The rest of the speech talks about how Americans' values are out of whack, how Americans are wasteful and need a more vibrant approach to the energy crisis. The speech ultimately called for a renewal of spirit, but all people remember is the part where Jimmy Carter was criticizing them, and it's gone down as a great example of Carter's political ineptitude. Now, in many ways, Carter was more important as a foreign policy president, but as with his energy initiatives, he's mostly remembered for his failures. Aiming to make human rights a cornerstone of America's foreign policy, Jimmy Carter tried to turn away from the Cold War framework and focus instead on combating third world poverty and reducing the spread of nuclear weapons. His greatest accomplishment was probably brokering the Camp David Accords. This historic peace agreement between Egypt and Israel has, as we all know, led to a lasting peace in the Middle East. Just kidding, but it has been a step in the right direction, and one that's lasted. But the US continued to support dictatorial regimes in Guatemala, the Philippines, and South Korea. Carter's most significant failure in terms of supporting international bad guys, though, is the Shah of Iran. Iran had oil and was a major buyer of American arms, but the Shah was really unpopular, and our support of him fueled anti-American sentiments in Iran. Those boiled over in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, especially after Carter allowed the Shah to get cancer treatments in America, which in turn prompted the storming of the American embassy in Tehran and the capture of 53 American hostages. Events in the Middle East also increased Cold War tensions, especially after 1979 when the USSR invaded Afghanistan. Carter claimed that the invasion of Afghanistan was the greatest threat to freedom since World War II and proclaimed the Carter Doctrine, which basically said that the U.S. would use force, if necessary, to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf region. High inflation and high unemployment had monumental effects in shaping America, and no president could have dealt with it effectively. Not Carter, not Gerald Ford, not anyone. The truth is, history isn't about individuals. Oil shocks and inevitable systemic changes led to the poor economy, and that weakened support for New Deal liberalism and increased the appeal of conservative ideas like lower taxes, reduced regulations, and cuts in social spending. All of which, for the record, started under the Democrat Jimmy Carter, not the Republican Ronald Reagan. More abstractly, the economic crisis of the 1970s dealt a serious blow to the Keynesian consensus that government action could actually solve macroeconomic problems.